Good morning. Good to be here with you again. This morning I'm still a little under the weather, but I sound better than Max, so I'm pretty happy about that. This morning we're going to be in Acts chapter 5. If you are willing to open up there, you follow along. And we are going to be taking a look at another example of someone that is faithful to God, and yet they're not a believer in the sense that we would think of normally. Now, this individual, we will say, is a Jew, and so they are, in fact, a believer in God, but they're not a Christian, at least not that we can see. And so we're going to take a look at their example of faith. And the person that we're talking about, the individual, is named Gamaliel. And so we're going to talk about him this morning. We're going to start with a little bit of context, a little bit of background in the book of Acts here in chapter 5. We'll start with verse 14. Acts chapter 5, verse 14. It says, "And believers were increasingly added to the Lord, and multitudes of both men and women." So, just starting out with that, we're in a period of growth of the early church, and it is growing tremendously, leaps and bounds, and this rapid growth means that there are more disciples being gained toward this movement, which means there's more influence of this movement, and in a sense, they're kind of gaining power. Not that that's what the early church is seeking out, and yet what we'll see from the opposite side of this is that the politically elite class are scared, and they're angry, because it turns out politicians throughout history have always feared one thing, which is losing the power that they have, or the influence that they have. And so one more follower for Jesus is one less follower for them, at least in their mind, and that's what we'll see. Verse 17, it says that the high priest rose up, and all those who were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and they were filled with indignation, and they laid their hands on the apostles and put them in the common prison. So the high priest, which would be Ananias at this time, who, by the way, is known for being kind of ruthless anyway, and he would end up being assassinated, sort of a live by the sword, die by the sword kind of life. And he is angry, along with those who are with him, which are the Sadducees. So evidently, either he's a Sadducee, or he at least sides with them, and they side with him. They're kind of in his corner politically. But he's going to, in the course of this night, call the whole of the Sanhedrin together. So it starts out as just the high priest and the Sadducees, but it'll end up being the whole group that is involved in this. And they are indignant, it says. Again, it seems that their potential loss of authority. And so they respond by throwing the apostles in prison, presumably all of the apostles, except obviously Judas, who's not with them anymore. But you would imprison all of these men just because they've been going around and preaching Christ to everyone. And so in the course of the night, though, after they've been thrown into prison, if you'll remember the story, an angel comes along, opens the doors of the prison, and the angel himself says that they should go back to the temple and they should continue to speak this same message that they have been before. And so that's exactly what they are going to do. Now, when morning comes, in verse 22, it says, "When the officers came and did not find them in the prison, they returned and reported, saying, 'Indeed, we found the prison shut securely, and the guards standing outside before the doors, but when we opened them, we found no one inside.'" And so they're confused. Not only are they confused, you get to verse 24, at the end of the verse it says of the high priest and the council that they wondered what the outcome would be. They didn't even know what was happening. And so everyone's confused because we've thrown these men into prison, and now they're not in prison. And so what are we going to do about it? Well, their solution is to call them back in. They call the apostles back before them because they don't have any other options. Apparently they can't imprison them. And they speak to them kind of as before. In verse 28 says, "Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and you intend to bring this man's blood on us," which that last statement has a bit of irony to it, doesn't it? That they're going to bring the blood of Jesus on the Sanhedrin, as if it wasn't already on them from the beginning. And then we get to verse 29, but Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. And so what they say to the apostles is, but didn't we command you not to do this? Didn't we who have authority command you? Didn't we who have political power over you and religious authority in theory, didn't we command you this? And the apostles answer, yep, you did. But who are we going to obey? You as our authority, or should we obey God as our authority? And so that question by itself is a good enough response, but recognize what it does to that council also. It says that you are not representing the authority of God. In fact, that you are at odds with the authority from God. Because we should obey him rather than obey you, because you are out of line. And so how do they respond? Well, as you would expect, verse 33, when they heard this, they were furious and plotted to kill them. So no surprise there, but the Jewish religious rulers are quick to get angry yet again. And so all of this takes place, and there's been somebody that's been watching this happen, and somebody that now is among this group and hearing these plots of how they're going to get rid of these people, how they're going to kill off the apostles because they're causing a problem politically for them. And so Gamaliel is introduced here in verse 34. It says, one of the council stood up, so he is one of the Sanhedrin, one of the kind of the Congress of the Jews. And he stands up, a Pharisee, so he himself is a Pharisee, but the Sadducees even are going to listen to him. And he's named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in respect by all the people, and commanded them to put the apostles outside for a little while. So he's introduced here as being well respected. Certainly he was. Part of the respect came from his pedigree, from his background being the grandson of one of the best known rabbis of that era. So he would have been long gone at this point, but his grandfather would have been Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, who was, like I say, one of the more important figures of that time period, and even down to today is still recognized among the Jews. But Gamaliel had earned his own reputation also as having wisdom, as having knowledge of the Word of God. We know him elsewhere in the New Testament as being the teacher of Saul of Tarsus, that Paul was taught by this same Gamaliel, we're pretty sure the same one, this Pharisee of Pharisees, as Paul would call himself. And so we see him there, but probably here he is an elderly man, at least by the standards of that day. He's probably maybe in his 70s, but that makes him one of the older members of the Sanhedrin, so even more respect just for having age on his side as well. But his advice is this, and this text often gets referred to as Gamaliel's advice. His advice is this, verse 35. It says, men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men. Now that by itself would be worth saying that this was some good advice. In fact, this advice is the same advice from James chapter 1, verse 26, isn't it? It's being slow to speak, being slow to wrath, being quick to listen. That's what he's saying here, especially on the slow to wrath. He says, hey, hold on just a minute. You all are plotting to kill 12 men at this point. You've replaced Judas as with another apostle. So you're going to kill 12 men. And he says, oh, why don't we just take a deep breath and think long and hard before we take this kind of action? Now he's saying that maybe for different reasons. He'll suggest some reasons in a second, but if nothing else, this is probably good advice, because what's going to happen if this Jewish council starts executing people by the dozens? How is Rome going to like that? Probably not so well. So maybe just for self-preservation reasons, it's pretty good advice. But he says, take heed to yourselves. Be careful about this. And then in verses 36 and 37, you can read those, but he gives two examples. One is named Theudas, who is a guy who came along several years before this, who had gathered a crowd and ultimately had ended up being killed. He was kind of leading a rebellion. Same thing happens again with a man by the name of Judas, not a Judas that we know, but a different man named Judas. And the same thing happens to him. He gets a following together. Ultimately, he's going to be killed And in both cases, it might be worth noting that while it's true that neither of these things came to amount to anything, they weren't put down by the Jewish Sanhedrin. They weren't put down by Jewish authority. Both of these revolts that he brings up, it was the Romans that took care of that. And so he's not suggesting that we need to do something as this council of the Jews. He says, hey, when this has happened before, not only did it work out how it was supposed to, but the Romans were the ones that handled it, so maybe we don't need to act on this so quickly. In verse 38, and now I say to you, keep away from these men, and let them alone, for if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. Verse 39, but if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against God. If this is from men, no problem. It'll end up just like the two examples I gave, right? It'll end up being taken down by the Romans. It'll end up not amounting to anything. And everything will work out just fine. And we don't have to have a hand in it. If, on the other hand, this is from God, if that's even a possibility, then what should we do? Now, the question that we would ask of Gamaliel here is, does he really think this might be from God? And I don't know the answer to that. All we have is this little snippet of his life, but it's possible. There are other members of the Sanhedrin like Nicodemus who are already disciples of Christ. So maybe he's been influenced by others, or maybe he just recognizes how quickly this movement is gaining traction, how different this movement is from the things that have come before. But there's something that makes him stop for just a second and say, if this is from God, I don't want to be found fighting against it. If this is from God, it's going to happen anyway, whether we get involved or not. So he gives a sound piece of advice there for all of life. We'll apply it in just a minute, but that's part of his advice. And the real danger is that if this is from God, that you could be found working against God's plan. That's never somewhere that we want to be. In verse 40, they agree with him. And again, it's not just Pharisees who are kind of aligned with him politically, but the Sadducees, including the high priest, they agree with him. They say, okay, yeah, you're right. We've kind of been talked down off the ledge now. They agree, and they graciously decide to only beat the apostles and command them to not do what they've been doing. So, as a result, the apostles are enthralled to have been able to suffer punishment like Christ did. That's their attitude about it. They are released. Verse 42, and daily in the temple and in every house they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. So they spend 0 seconds obeying man, and they go immediately back to what they were doing before, which is what you would expect from them. So that's the end of the story as far as Gamaliel goes. It's a pretty simple and short story there. The apostles get in trouble. Gamaliel, in a way, bails them out of trouble. And they end up continuing to preach, and we don't really see a whole lot else from Gamaliel. And so our first kind of question, we've asked this already, but did Gamaliel have real faith? And it kind of depends on what you mean. If you mean faith in God, then yes. He was already a Jew. He was already someone who believed in God. But it wasn't just that. He understood some things that maybe others were not understanding. He had the wisdom to stand up and say, listen, this is how God operates. That if God is going to do something, it will happen. And if he wants it to happen, it'll happen whether we stand in the way or not. But we don't want to be found being in opposition to him. So he had that kind of understanding. Now, whether he ever moved from Judaism to Christianity, I don't know. We really aren't told. But it's possible. I mean, it's possible that he saw the growth of the church after this, and that he recognized that this must be from God, based on all the signs. It's possible. It's possible that his student, Paul, maybe interacted with him later on. Maybe was able to reach him and convince him of these things, but we don't know because we aren't told. But we do see him having faith in God, and we see him having an understanding when others didn't necessarily. Another thing that I want to point out with this story is that we have a tendency when we read to do a couple things maybe. One, we see this as a story, and so it's hard for us to remember that this is a life and death situation for 12 men, real people that actually were alive, that actually could have died. I think we do that partially because it's so far in the past for us, but I think we might also do it, this might be a strange analogy, but if you've ever started watching a show, watching a series, and the series has already been off the air for a while, then you assume that as much danger as they may put the title character in, that they can't really die because the show lasted 5 or 6 seasons, right? Well, they can't kill off the main character. Well, you kind of view the apostles that way here. You say, well, they're not really in any danger. It wasn't like God was going to let them die. Well, there's a problem with that. What happens in the next chapter? Stephen, one of the first deacons in the church, he gets killed. He gets stoned to death. What happens a couple chapters after that? James, one of these 12 men, he gets executed. So these men were in real danger of actually being killed by, another reminder, the exact same group that less than a year ago put Jesus on the cross. They could have suffered the same fate right then, but they didn't. And why not? Well, probably because it was part of God's plan, but if it was, then what does that mean for Gamaliel? That means that he was the piece that fit into that providential need to preserve the apostles for this time. It means that he was there and he was willing to fulfill the role that God had for him. And that's how providence works a lot of times, that a single person can cause great harm, or in this case, they can cause great good. And in this case, specifically preserving the lives of the apostles, at least for a time. Now, we've brought it up already, but for Gamaliel, even though he does this here, that probably is not the greatest impact that he has on the church as a whole. Instead, his greatest impact, more than likely, is who he taught. That is, that he was the one who educated Paul. And so we don't get Paul, not the one we know, not the educated one that's able to make these deep spiritual points throughout his letters. That doesn't happen unless he's taught by Gamaliel the Pharisee. And so his impact is felt throughout the New Testament, even if you barely see him mentioned. For us, a question kind of arises from this story. The question being this: do we trust that God is going to take care of what is his? Will God take care of the things that are his business? Because we know a lot of things in this world are not according to God. They're not part of God's plan. Things are in opposition to him. They are instead the plan or the work of men, to quote from this text. Well, if those things are the plans and the works of men, then what will be their ultimate result? Gamaliel told us, and he's right. Their ultimate result is that they will come to nothing. It will be as if it never happened. It won't matter in one sense. Now, that being said, of course, if these things of the world stay around for decades, can they cause problems? Yes, they can. So there's a balance here, that these plans of men sometimes can have disastrous results in the short term, but ultimately they will come to nothing. And so we can balance that, but still there's a point worth making here that sometimes we focus too little on what we can do in response to the world, and sometimes we focus too much on what we think we can do in response to the world. And we think that it's something that we're going to have to fix, when sometimes maybe the answer is the advice of Gamaliel, that if this thing is not from God but is from man, it will come to nothing. And for myself, then the question becomes this: like the apostles, if I'm waiting to see what God will do, the only question I have is, what am I going to do in the meantime? And so the question becomes the same as the apostles: am I going to serve man in the meantime while I wait for this to come to nothing, or am I going to serve God? And so for the apostles, as bold as they are in teaching, And as much as their work is fixing the world, they're also, in a sense, letting God take care of his business, as Gamaliel advises the whole of the Sanhedrin here. And in the meantime, the apostles are going to go about preaching and teaching, because that's what God's will is for them. So what will we do in the meantime? The other thing that we'll say, kind of as we close this morning, is that this kind of faith that we've seen in Gamaliel, this successful faith, I think it's fair to call it, a successful faith can look different at different times. It can do different things. It can require different things of us. And so sometimes a successful faith means that we will be required to speak up when everyone else is wanting to make a rash decision. When everybody else is wanting to respond in anger, when everyone else is wanting to ultimately kill 12 men in this case, but sometimes that means we'll have to step up into that place and say, hold on everybody, let's take a deep breath, let's rethink this for just a moment. Sometimes it also means being willing to trust that God will take action. And so that's almost the opposite. To say sometimes it requires us to step up into that place, and sometimes it requires us to step back and say, well, I can't do anything, but God can. And if this is from men, it will come to nothing. But if it's from God, then it will work out the way that God intends for it to. Sometimes it may require us to go back the opposite extreme there, to do something that even ends up with us landing in prison, as it did for the apostles. And sometimes it will require us instead to take a step back and say, you know what, maybe God is the one that needs to act here. And maybe I need to become less so that God can become more. But regardless of all of those sides of it, one thing will always be true of faith that is successful, which is that it will always put God's plan first. And it will always put God's will before itself. But I think if there's nothing else that you remember from this lesson, maybe just remember this. You already know and you already remember that this example of the apostles here is wonderful because it shows that principle. It reminds us that we put God's will before man's. That's the whole quote, that we ought to obey God rather than man, right? But they aren't the only ones in the story that obey God rather than man. Because the Sanhedrin, if you'll remember, is 70 or 71, depending on how you count it, 70 men that all think that they are important, and they all have a political agenda, and they're all powerful in their own right within this circle. But one man stepped up, and he said, like the apostles did, essentially, or he acted this way, should I listen to all of you, or should I obey God? So certainly the apostles are the example here, but Gamaliel serves as an example for us as well. So we can follow that example, but ultimately the reminder is that we can put God before anything else, and should put God before anything else, especially just the ideas or just the commands of men. This morning, God has made a command that applies to every person. The command is to come to him. And that command can be applied whether you have never become a child of God. Now's your chance. Now is your opportunity. Don't waste it. But this morning also, God has commanded that if you have left from him, if you're wandering from him, that you should return home. If there's anything that the church can do this morning, if there's a need that can be met this morning, then we ask that you come forward as we stand, as we sing.